Yeah, what do we do now? How do we actually do something with that information and make it into, one, an investable portfolio, but two, one that is aware of the risk return demands that all of the asset owners around the world have? Over to you, Guido.
Thanks, Nayan, and thanks, Lucian, for your introduction into really all the frameworks that are out there related to climate change and that are all relevant to investors. Let's first reiterate what the goal of these new capabilities that we are launching is. And if we go to the next slide, and we see that it's really part of our mission that we aim to make our contribution to the Paris Agreement as a company as a whole. And part of that is the launch of these new Paris-aligned fixed income strategies. And with those, we want to be at the forefront of the transition. And if we go on the next slide, we see the key elements of these strategies. And as I said, the forefront of the transition, keeping the temperature rise to a maximum of 2 degrees and aiming for one that is more closely to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So really bring to life the commitment that we made to the Paris Agreement. For this, we'll start with a low emission intensity and a reduction in this emission intensity of 7% year on year. And that follows what was just explained in the glide path and all the different scenarios that are there. And I'll show you how this is translated into a practical approach for investors. We will manage these strategies in an active way, given we are an active house, also aiming to deliver alpha over the cycle and using our known approach in fixed income investing. So ESG integration is part of it, diversification, selection, and also having a prudent approach. On the next slide, we see how we define sustainable investing. And I want to quickly stipulate how what we just saw in terms of risk and opportunities, and also the impact that we want to create, how this seamlessly goes with how we define sustainable investing. So this is all about the interaction between an issuer of securities and society at large. And if we ask ourselves the question, how does sustainable development affect an issuer? Then we're talking about risk and opportunities. And that is part of ESG integration if we translate that into the investment process. So that's taking into account what is happening in society in terms of institutional frameworks as well, consumer preferences, and then how this affects the ability of an issuer to generate value in the short, medium, and long term. On the other side, we can ask the question basically in the other way around: how does an issuer affect sustainable development? And this is the area of impact investing and potentially also of exclusions, if you think that this contribution to society of a certain issuer is outright negative. And here is where the 2-degree alignment comes into play, and the emissions profile and how an issuer fits within what is needed to stay well below 2 degrees of temperature rise by the end of the century. And these two interact with one another. Of course, through the impact that an issuer has, this may have an effect on then the ability to generate value in the long term. So then the impact feeds back through ESG integration into the investment process. But important that these are two elements that we look into, also two that are very much related to climate change from the risk and opportunities and from the temperature rise perspective, and that both elements are present in our investment process. We can then go to the next slide. With the introduction of the climate strategies, we'll have 3 types of impact investing, essentially, that we see in fixed income. So 3 types of taking into account both these elements of ESG integration and impact investing in the investment process. We have the SDG credit range, which is aimed at a broad range of topics. So it's a broad sustainability purpose, so to say. We have the climate capabilities that we are launching, will be launching soon, that have a real climate impact purpose. And of course, we have a green bond capability, which is an environmental impact purpose in the sense that it's slightly broader than just climate. Climate change is very much part of it. It's about financing renewable energy, but also biodiversity, clean water, a reduction of pollution are part of what is targeted with green bonds. On the next slide, we see what Paris alignment actually means. And this also relates back to what Luc-Jan was explaining about the glide paths. So if we want to keep temperature rise well below 2 degrees, what that means is that the global emissions of greenhouse gases will need to decline. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has calculated different scenarios. And that's the graph you see on the left bottom side of the slide. Well, there are various different scenarios with a steep decarbonization in the beginning, or maybe slightly slower, but then beyond 2050 you need to do more. But if we generally calculate the decarbonization that would be necessary into a more stylized version and something that can actually work for managing portfolios, then we find the graph on the right-hand side. So we have a minimum decarbonization trajectory in red that the world would need to follow to stay well below these 2 degrees. And we see that that means cutting the emissions in half in 2030 and slowly going towards 2050. And this is actually a 7% year-on-year decarbonization pathway. If we then look at the ambition of the climate credit strategy, it will already take a huge cut in emissions, 50% from the start. So really being at the forefront, as I said before. So we already take this lower emission starting point, so already selecting those issuers that are well underway in their transition and making a contribution to climate change mitigation, and where we see opportunities. And then we also follow a further decarbonization pathway, which in absolute terms will slowly converge with the minimum decarbonization trajectory, and it will also follow the 7% year-on-year decarbonization trajectory. And as I said, this is really bringing to life, we feel, a commitment to the Paris Agreement. And on the next slide, we see that we will launch 2 capabilities, the Robeco Climate Global Bonds, an aggregate, and the Climate Global Credits, focused on corporate bonds. What we also see is that they will be managed against the so-called Paris-aligned index, and I'll explain what that means in a bit. And both have the aim to really make this contribution to the Paris Agreement, while being diversified portfolios and outperforming their benchmarks, so delivering alpha over the cycle. And how can we do this? Well, on the next slide, we see that climate change and everything that relates to climate change needs to be integrated in every step of the investment process to really make this happen. It is not enough to just define the universe differently, so to exclude a lot of companies, but it really has to be part of the investment analysis of bottom-up issuer selection and of portfolio construction, and then even feeding through into risk management with the different scenario analyses. And of course, after portfolio implementation, after we have invested, then we also have engagement with the companies that we invest in. There are some exclusions, though, some specific exclusions, which very much relate to the production of fossil fuels, such as coal and oil. But what is much more important is that it is really about selecting those issuers that are well underway in their transition. I mean, this is very much still a diversified portfolio, investing in the broader fixed income markets. So the exclusions are fairly limited. It's much more about finding the opportunities and investing in the players of tomorrow's Paris-aligned economy, so to say. So the forward-looking element is very important, as is the current emission profile to ensure that we stay on this pathway of decarbonization by 7% year on year. Then these capabilities will be managed against a so-called Paris-aligned index. And on the next slide, I'll explain a little bit more what that means. So a Paris-aligned benchmark in the EU is now subject to regulation, and it's one of the 10 actions in the EU Sustainable Finance Plan that Jan also mentioned. And this benchmark proposal really focuses on corporates. We also translated the philosophy behind this for an aggregate benchmark. And we've also seen that in the fixed income space, there is no such benchmark yet on a global, for a global credit portfolio or a global aggregate. And here we're really pioneering, and this pioneering is something that is in the DNA of Robeco, and we teamed up with a benchmark provider to develop those indices in a way that they also work in global credit and in global aggregate. We will use as to measure where we are in terms of decarbonization, so-called scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And this relates to the operations of a company, but also beyond it in the value chain. And I'll explain what that means. For sovereigns, we will use CO2 emissions per capita. If we then zoom in on the scope 1, 2, and 3, on the next slide, we see what that actually means. You might have heard about scope 1, 2, and 3, and then data challenges and all this complexity around it. And that is indeed all there. But first, let's look into what it actually is. So scope 1 are direct emissions. So that these are emissions caused by the entity itself. So if you use fossil fuels or you emit other greenhouse gases, for instance, methane that might leak into the atmosphere, which is also a greenhouse gas, that would be a scope 1 emission. So it's you emitting. Scope 2 are all the emissions that are caused by your usage of energy. So if you use electricity as a company or also as an individual, you have sort of direct link to the emissions that are caused for the production of this electricity, because if you didn't use this electricity, it didn't need to be generated. So that is what we call scope 2. So it is not your emission, but it's directly attributable to you because you use this electricity and that was generated, for instance, using fossil fuel. But then we have scope 3, and scope 3 is something that is relatively complex. It's also very, very large. It contains upstream and downstream elements in the value chain, divided into 15 different categories. And here we, for instance, have the usage of products. And this is important in the case of car manufacturers, for instance, because the scope 1 emissions of a car manufacturer stem from its production process. Let's say some installations would run on gas. That would be a scope 1 emission. That's fairly limited. Scope 2 emissions would be the uses of electricity, also in the production process, probably significant for a car manufacturer. But where most of the emissions are in the use phase of the cars, especially if they use fossil fuels, for instance, if it's a petrol engine that the car is equipped with. And the car manufacturer is not emitting this, it's the user of the car. However, the car manufacturer can be held accountable, because if the global emissions are to decline, then of course more fuel efficient cars or cars that have an alternative powertrain than an internal combustion engine will emit less of these, what then for the car manufacturer will be scope 3 emissions, so downstream in the value chain. Obviously, this is not easy to assess for figures, and in some, with cars, it's fairly straightforward. In some other industries, it's much more complex, and that's where we are doing a lot of research, and also where Georgi in his session after me will have something to add on this. If we then go back to the investment strategy, so we've talked about the benchmark proposal and the benchmark using these scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, following a decarbonization pathway, also being very mindful of the transition pathway that companies are on. Then you might wonder, can you still build an index? And the answer is yes, we can. And also one that has very similar characteristics of the regular global credit index. And in this case, this regular global credit index would be the Bloomberg Barclays Global Ag Corp. And we find that the yield profile, for instance, is almost the same. Also in terms of the spread duration and interest duration, we can hedge that in such a way that this is similar. Credit spread looks fairly similar, and the average rating is similar, but the CO2 intensity is much lower. So it is possible to generate a benchmark, a reference benchmark for our funds. Of course, it's an active strategy, so it's just a reference benchmark for investments. But given that the yield profile looks fairly similar and other characteristics as well, we have also been we feel confident that this will be something that will generate comparable returns over the cycle. Then the investment process, of course, is not just a benchmark, especially not given it's an active strategy, where the bottom-up issue selection is a very important element of our investment process. For this, we have a credit analyst team, a very large credit analyst team, I would say, that looks at the fundamental credit quality of issuers in 5 different components. And these 5 you see on the slide. We look at the business position, the corporate strategy. Always we look at the ESG profile, and corporate structure and financial profile, and we assign our own internal fundamental ratings dependent on the external credit rating. Climate change will also be part of this. And if we see on the next slide how we will factor in climate change in all these different steps, we see that it starts all with the current positioning of the issuer, and this is where the emissions profile is important. It's the same as looking into the balance sheet of a company. That gives you just an overview of where the company is right now. It doesn't necessarily tell you everything about where the company is heading. And it's the same with the emissions. Emissions are very relevant to assess where a company is right now. But then, of course, we need to understand what are the drivers of these emissions and what is then the ability of a company to change these the emission profile that it has. For that, of course, we then further look into the climate strategy. As you would look into a corporate strategy, you can look into a climate strategy. Its long-term goals. Does it have any long-term goals? Does it have any short-term and medium-term goals? And what is the CapEx and R&D activity into this? Is the company working on new solutions? For instance, activities that are aligned with the so-called EU taxonomy, which is another part of legislation consisting on, well, basically definitions of what economic activities fit within a Paris-aligned economy. So what is the CapEx of a company? What is the R&D of a company? And then a final step in assessing this climate change opportunities and risk for a company is what is the funding? Because companies might be positioned in a certain way and have a decent strategy, but can they also afford to make the transition? What will be the impact on free cash flow and on leverage? These are very important questions for us as credit investors to ask. Also, we see issuing of green bonds, which can be a very helpful tool to finance the transition for a company. So current positioning, climate strategy, but then also very much the funding. And that is where the expertise of an experienced credit team is very important to have, I think, to be able to fully integrate this into the investment process. Diving slightly deeper into sectors, we see that they differ from one another, not surprisingly, in CO2 intensity. And if we look into our investable universe for the climate capabilities, we see that automotive and building materials are very much the more carbon intense sectors, and construction machinery and mining also. And of course, things that relate to the pharmaceuticals, let's say, are much less carbon intense. But all of this is part of the investable universe of the credit capabilities, given that they are really a diversified, that's a diversified global capability, which I think could even be considered a core credit allocation. When assessing especially those sectors that are more carbon intense, like automotive, we will use this EU taxonomy. And let me explain to you briefly on the next slide what that means. So if we look at the investable universe, we have the broad credit markets, and we will include exclude certain companies, but not more than 10% of the broader universe, so really not an extreme amount, because we want to invest in a broad universe. And in that, we will find industries that have no significant impact on climate change, like pharmaceuticals, and they will be part of this Paris-aligned fixed income strategy. But also there are industries with a significant impact on climate change. The ones we saw, the automotive, building materials, and the like. And here we have companies that are making a transition or that are already investing in green activities, so these so-called taxonomy aligned activities. We have companies that are in transition, but also we have companies that are not really making this transition, and they are not formally excluded in the sense that they will be on some sort of list that is monitored. But the portfolio managers are not likely to buy these, given that they won't fit in this strategy, given that they won't fit in the desired and necessary decarbonization pathway of the fixed income Paris-aligned strategies. And the same we will do on the sovereign side, and that is then the next slide, where we see that countries also differ from one another. Not as much as companies differ, but they do differ. And we see that countries like Australia and Canada are very much carbon intense countries, so a high CO2 per capita. The US is also still there, though has been declining steadily over the last 20 years even, where Australia and Canada have not necessarily. We see some European countries more in the middle, the Netherlands in purple and very flat, not much of decarbonization happening. Denmark, on the other hand, massive investments in renewables, especially wind energy, offshore wind energy, and we see a green line coming down in the last 10 years. So also here, for allocation to sovereigns in the aggregate Paris-aligned fixed income strategy, we will look into the current position, but also the transition pathway that sovereigns are on. Which then brings me to the conclusion. And we see that these Paris-aligned fixed income capabilities are meant to keep the temperature rise well below 2 degrees while investing in a broader fixed income markets, so including all sectors that you would find in any core credit or any core fixed income portfolio, while being mindful of the impact that they have. So fossil fuels are not necessarily something that fits nicely within this, but anything that is any industry that's able to make the transition will be part of the portfolio. It's very much managed in the same way as we know at Robeco, so it's unconstrained. We have a contrarian approach as well. We like different. Exploit, so to say, the inefficiencies that exist in our view in fixed income markets, and we'll be working in close cooperation with all the different teams, so with Lucian, with the data scientists that we have on climate, and with all the research capability that we have in the broader organization. And with that, I would like to conclude my my presentation, and over to you, Naeem.
Thank you very much again, Guido. We have received a couple of questions, and again, remind you all that you can submit some via the question mark button. The first one, and I very much like these kind of questions, I suspect I know the answer, Guido, is do you believe that there will be a good versus evil situation in terms of valuations of these companies as the world gets more serious about climate change? So do you see the values of climate change becoming a key driver of company valuations?
I think that we will see that. To be fully honest with you, we don't see that yet in the valuations of companies, but I think it's something that we will see, especially in the next few years when this is really catching on. I think the attention for the topic is massive. And with the uptake of this in value by the financial markets, I think we will see absolutely an influence on valuations, and then this very much also be taken into account even in portfolios that don't necessarily have this impact element in them, but also simply from a valuation perspective, where investing in certain economic activities will make no sense anymore.
Thank you. And I think certainly from a broader perspective at Robeco, we've always had the mantra of looking for additional insights to which we can make investment decisions. And certainly carbon risks are one of those additional insights that we pay special attention to now. And Georgie will talk you through a little bit more about how we're working on pioneering some ways to do that in a moment. I do have one more question for you, Guido, and that is because this is a sort of fixed income investment strategy where transaction costs and turnover are quite important. Will this continual reduction cause a challenge to performance due to additional turnover, or are there any other sort of performance headwinds that you might expect to encounter becoming Paris aligned?
Very fair point. And that is where the forward-looking element in the bottom-up issue selection is so important. Because indeed, if we would just follow only the emissions pathway as a sort of constraint, without integrating climate change in all the steps of the investment process, then indeed you could face undesired turnover simply because you run into the limit that you have set for the emission intensity. But since we integrate it in every step of the way, and especially in the bottom-up issue selection, looking forward into the transition plans and the transition capability of issuers, I think that our portfolio managers will be able, and for sure they will aim, to select those issuers that will fit in the decarbonization trajectory, therefore limiting the undesired turnover because of the pathway that we're on, because it's very much, I think, one of the beauties of being an active manager, and also even for this as a fundamental strategy where we can very much incorporate this forward-looking element, so ensure that we stay on the desired pathway without having to create excess turnover or undesired turnover, which indeed in fixed income is something that would lead to transaction costs that for sure we want to avoid.
Great. So picking the right companies will allow them to decarbonize so that we don't have to change the portfolio. I think that's a very nice sentiment to end on. So thank you, Guido, for your slides. Again, Guido will be here at the end. So any more questions for him in particular, please do submit them.